Okay, so welcome to this next session. I'm going to just talk a little bit about the next couple of days, the program for the next couple of days, and then go into the material. And the material today isn't so dense as some of the last two sessions, so it'll be easier for us to get into it. Yeah, so this is our last session on doing hearing a presentation and then doing discussion or having discussion groups. Tomorrow we're going to do a question-answer session on sadhana. So please send us any of your questions around that. I mean, obviously you can also, we'll be able to take questions from the floor, as it were, from the computer, but also to have a few things in advance would be helpful. Yeah.
Sadhana generally.
Yeah, sadhana generally. Yeah, sadhana generally would be great. Thank you, Arya Dara. Sorry, Arya Dara. And then after that'll be the first part of the morning, and then the first part of that session, and then after that we'll do a short reporting out, all as one group, and this will allow Padma Siddhi and Dhiramani to be contributing to that before they disappear into their beds later. By that time it will be almost midnight in Australia. Yeah, so it'd be good to have you guys involved. And then the next session today is going to be an unled sadhana practice, and so just come along to that. We'll probably do a reading and then just sit in the shrine room together and do a sadhana practice together. And then tomorrow in that session, I'll lead the Shakyamuni sadhana more the way that I tend to do it rather than what's on the script. And the final session today, we've got this slideshow from Sadharaja on the pilgrimage sites from India. So that'll be very enjoyable, I'm sure. And then the last session tomorrow is more, I think it's just going to be meditation and puja. Yeah, so we just thought we'd lay it out a little bit. It's it just gives you a bit of a shape for where we're all headed. Yeah. So just to note that this morning will be the last time we'll be in these particular breakout groups. Just bear that in mind when you're in the group. Okay, so let's go into the text then for this morning. Yeah, maybe I'll just read the verses that we'll be covering. So from Thanissara's translation, I'll read it from there. Dhaniya says, "The stakes are dug in, immovable. The new manja grass halters, well woven, not even young bulls could break. So if you want, rain god, go ahead and reign." And the Buddha says, "Having broken my bonds like a great bull, like a great elephant tearing a rotting vine, I never again will lie in the womb. So if you want, rain god, go ahead and reign." And then we have this dramatic moment where it rains, basically. The great rain rains straight down, filling the lowlands and highlands. Hearing the rain god pour down, Dhaniya says, "How great our gain that we've gazed on the Blessed One. We go to him, the one with vision, for refuge. May you be our teacher, great sage. My wife and I," very English, "my wife and I are compliant. Let's follow the holy life under the one well gone to the far shore of aging and death." It doesn't make sense. Gone to the far shore of aging and death. Let's put an end to suffering and stress. And then Mara comes in. "Those with children delight because of their children. Those with cattle delight because of their cows. A person's delight comes from acquisitions, since a person with no acquisitions doesn't delight." And the Buddha replies to Mara, "Those with children grieve because of their children. Those with cattle grieve because of their cows. A person's grief comes from acquisitions, since a person with no acquisitions doesn't grieve." I asked Dhammamai to have a look at the text, at the Pali version of the text, just to see the kind of age that the text was. And she says it's a very, very old one. It's not totally the oldest, but it's from a very old chapter in the Sutta Nipata. And it's, what does she say? It is very, very old. I'm looking at her now. It is very, very old. And the commentaries or the translators are looking and thinking those last two verses are add-ons, which does make sense because they don't entirely, they look a bit like add-ons, don't they? You know, you get this moment where Dhaniya says, I go for refuge to the Buddha. And then you get Mara coming in about this thing about having children and acquisitions, and then the Buddha has to reply to that. So those last two verses are probably things that have come in later. Yeah, so Bantu talks a bit about the whole dynamic between the free individual, i.e. the Buddha, the liberated one, confronting the restricted individual. And Buddhism has, as its vision, as its ideal, well, it describes itself as a path of freedom. The Dharma has one taste, the taste of freedom. So the outcome or the kind of ideal or the vision of the Dharma is to be more free, is to be liberated from restrictions or being bounded. So I was just thinking, I wonder in what way do we invest in freedom? And are we sensitive to areas where we are restricted? I know I'm particularly sensitive to areas where my communication feels a bit restricted because I'm just not individual enough to say what I really want to say. And do we explore that in terms of individuality, like in terms of the worldly winds, or in terms of mental states, greed, hatred, and delusion? Because this is the freedom that we're free from. We're free from greed, hatred, and delusion. It's not that we're free to choose whether we have coffee and tea or tea. That's a different kind of choice. It's more, how do we move in this world with a freedom to be creative, a choice in terms of how we respond to a situation. Yeah, so I haven't done this myself, but I was thinking, oh, it might be interesting to explore, you know, if you bring in the idea of freedom being the freedom from certain mental states rather than some sort of external limitations, what difference would it make to your relationship with those external conditions? I mean, we do set very strong sort of habits, sort of train lines, as it were, through our life. We're often caught in one's habit of choice or caught in one's habit of comfort or the known. There's that famous story, isn't there, of the fish basket, the fish seller choosing to sleep under the fish basket because it's a familiar smell, rather than choosing to sleep under a basket of flowers, which is a more beautiful smell from a certain point of view, but it's actually an unfamiliar smell. So we prefer our normal smell to anything that smells different. And somebody in the seminar says rebirth is an addiction, which is quite a nice, neat little statement. Rebirth is an addiction. Not necessarily rebirth at the end of this life, although that could be the addiction, that could be the addictive path as well. But in our lives, how often do we follow the addictive tendency in ourselves, you know? A certain, you know, how we reach for certain foods in a certain moment when we've got an experience of discomfort, or we react in a certain relationship in exactly the same way that we usually do. I was saying in my group yesterday this lovely metaphor that Bhante uses in the Dhammapada when he talks about the Buddha being trackless. And he said, if you're trackless, Mara doesn't know where to find you. but he knows really easily where to find us. He just has to hang out at exactly the corner where we always go. You know, he's usually hanging out in the kitchen at about 5 o'clock in the evening for me. And I walk into the kitchen. I wasn't planning to have a little snack, but somehow, I don't know, I end up having a little snack then. And Mara's there just thinking, oh, I don't really need to tamper with her life. She's already under control. Yeah. He's just hanging out, smoking a cigarette, you know, like one of those sort of cool 1940s film stars. You know? It doesn't have to do any work. Okay, then another image that Bhante uses later on is in describing the whole conversation between Dhaniya and the Buddha. He's saying that all the time, although Dhaniya is trying to sort of shore up himself, something of the Buddha's experience is getting through to him. And he talks about this story of the 20th blow. So this idea that, you know, you have somebody hammer onto a rock with, and nothing happens, and then nothing happens. He describes this very fully in that little booklet called The Meaning of Conversion, in the last lecture, which I think is on the Yogacara, turning about in the deepest seat of consciousness, where Bhante says, you know, that we're like, the empirical self is like a rock that needs to be cracked open, and you keep hammering away at your habits, hammering away at certain tendencies in oneself, and as far as you can see, nothing is happening. And then at some point, that habit cracks. And you think that was the only thing that did it, but all the way through, something has been happening. And I've used this reading a lot because it's very encouraging. It's meaning something is happening even if we can't tell that it's happening. So it is a very encouraging message in it. But in real life, it's very hard to stay inspired. You never know if you're still on number 6 in terms of the last blow, or whether you're on the 19th one. How do we stay inspired, or how do we stay encouraged in the long, slow process of change? You know, how do we nourish our spiritual lives in that process? I once had a discussion on a study leaders event with Ratnaguna, and I was having a reaction to the word nourishment. And he was noticing this, and so he decided to give me a teaching. He gave it to all of us, but I'm thinking it might have been to me as well, particularly. Anyway, he said something like, there's 2 kinds of nourishment. This is a classic Triratna. There's vertical nourishment and there's horizontal nourishment. Okay, and it's a really interesting distinction. So horizontal nourishment means we can nourish ourselves in quite a kind of ordinary way, which I think does help us get through our life. It's when you sit and have a cup of tea and look out the window, or you listen to a beautiful piece of music, or you have a very enjoyable conversation with somebody, or you lie on your bed and maybe watch a film that just relaxes your mind. All of those things are very helpful, positive. But it's only nourishing you on a very ordinary kind of horizontal level. It's not demanding anything from you. It's not raising you up to anything. And we don't want to engage with more vertical nourishment because it requires effort from us. This is what I realized. To have the conversation that we're trying to resist having, even though it's going to be very helpful in the long run, requires more energy, it requires more effort. So it doesn't feel nourishing, it feels like it's effort and work. Or, I don't know, to study a bit of Dharma might feel like it's effort. Or to go on solitary rather than to go and lie on the beach, it feels like effort. And all of these things make a demand on us, which we don't want to make, and we resist it. And sometimes we resent the demands that kind of nourishment will make on us. And because it requires effort from us, it feels like it isn't nourishment to begin with, although in hindsight you realize that it has been. So maybe this is something that we could look at in the groups. Then there's this description of Bhante's description of going for refuge. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah. So at some point later on in the verses, Dhaniya and his wife go for refuge to the Buddha. And this is how Bhante describes it in the seminar. This is very important and significant because you see the significance of the going for refuge. The going for refuge, so to speak, is a spontaneous response to this overwhelming experience in which the limitations of your whole existing mode of being are revealed, and in which you can see the possibility of freedom and recognize your affinity for that. You just, as it were, not exactly automatically, but simply spontaneously, just go in that direction. You give yourself, you commit yourself to that, and that is what the going for refuge represents. So what's happened is that this 20th blow, if you like, happens. So it happens it happens in this verse where the rain pours down and the thunder crashes. And this could be a metaphor, a bit like when reality breaks into our consciousness. It's like something crashes in and we see something very, very differently. So that's a sort of an interruption, I suppose, of our usual consciousness. I mean, maybe also the rain really did start pouring down and suddenly we've got a tsunami, we've got a dangerous situation. And maybe at that point, Dhaniya thinks, oh, the situation is much more out of control and the reality crashes in then. So whichever way you choose to interpret it, Dhaniya goes for refuge. And maybe there's something in that you might want to talk about. Do people relate to this term, going for refuge? Some people don't like it. So it'd be interesting to just hear it. Some people find this idea of refuge tricky for them. It feels like an escape or that you're weak or something like that. So maybe just have a look at that as a metaphor. Does it work for you? And maybe also have a look at whether you've experienced reality crashing in that kind of way. Sometimes it happens quite simply. I remember, sometimes it happens in a moment of embarrassment or sort of shame, where you realize that your perception of a situation isn't accurate. And that's very humbling. And that feels like a kind of reality crashing in, where you suddenly see yourself a bit more as you are, rather than what you think you are. I remember going into, I was in another retreat center, and because I'm used to running retreat centers, for some other reason I felt I could take the initiative, and I decided to alter the heating system because it was too cold. So I altered the heating system and it got colder and colder and colder. And then I realized for this horrible meditation, I turned it the wrong way. Huh. And then somebody made an announcement the next day, could somebody not alter the heating system? And I felt so much shame because I thought, it just completely demolished my idea of me knowing what needed to be done and then doing it well. I had to sit through a number of meditations where I had to face that in myself. It was a very small moment, but it was a bit of reality crashing in there, into my consciousness. Yeah, so sometimes it happens like that, and sometimes it happens with, I don't know, a bereavement. Somebody dying very suddenly, for instance, or I'm sure we've all got these experiences where things have been a bit different from what we thought, and it reflects us back. Or does it reflect us back? I mean, this is interesting. I used to say sometimes insight is simply the ability to learn from one's experience. And I just mentioned that in a very kind of glib way, but that's because we don't. What stops us from just learning from our experience? So often we're shored up from the information that is already out there. There's a lot of information coming in from the world and from our relationships, but we're not really receiving that information. Yeah, so Yeah, and it just made me think about that. You know, are you creating a mind that is like the Kalachitta that I was talking about in the first presentation? A mind that is ready for the Dharma, a mind that is actually receiving the information that is between us and another person or in the world generally, and in the situation, so that we are living a life with more perception, a more insightful way of life, yeah? That's more in tune with reality. And then we get these last couple of verses, which are the later additions. And they're talking about how, from a worldly point of view, if you have possessions, if you have family, then you have happiness. And then the Buddha's saying, if you have family, if you have possessions, then you have grief. And Bhante is saying, well, it's not really like that, is it? Of course it's not like that. And he says, you can't have delight. Unfortunately, you can't have delight, you can't have enjoyment entirely separate from having grief as well. Because our delight is based upon something that is impermanent. Of course, it's not just that the thing out there is impermanent, we're impermanent. Sometimes the separation between what we love is because we die, not because the other thing is impermanent. Bhante says, it's not so much a question of being free from affection or free from wanting to enjoy life or free from delight. It's something beyond that. It's something beyond the duality between delight and grief, these two sort of oppositions. And he says, there's this arrow of attachment that has been removed. And it reminded me how many years ago, I went to a particular situation, Buddhist center, and I spent a week there. And I was involved in a lot of conversations, and I was living in the community there, and I was meeting people from like 8 o'clock in the morning until 8 o'clock at night. I was attending meetings and being around the center, being around the right livelihood. And it was changing my consciousness. I was incredibly freed in that week and felt very sort of creative and loose, and like I knew my consciousness was being changed by that experience. And I thought, oh, this isn't how my life feels at Taraloka. And then I created a mantra for myself, or a kind of slogan for myself. I thought, how do I engage without investment? Because that's what I realized I was doing generally in my life. When I was engaging with a situation like Taraloka, I was also investing in Taraloka, or I'm investing in Adhisthana, and the self is invested in it. Whereas in this other situation, I didn't have anything invested, and I was incredibly engaged, which was a very different experience. So I was asking myself, yeah, how do I engage without investment? I also did a reflection exercise, probably around the same sort of time. I was learning this reflection exercise from Ratnaguna, and he and I were doing it together. And I was asking the question over and over again, how do I love without attachment? Or is it possible to love without attachment? And I was leading a lot of Brahmaviharas retreats, and in a way you're trying to communicate, how does one love without attachment? I think a lot of these quite strong, passionate feelings are much simpler than we realize. I think the complexity and the density of those experiences are sometimes to do with the attachment and not to do with the love. If you see what I mean? Yeah. Yeah, so the whole, this whole sutta is a description, if you like, of a kind of universal conversation. A conversation between two people where somebody has got greater awareness, more insight, brings a vertical dimension into the communication. And that's having an impact on the other person. And it's a meeting that we all need to be engaged with in different ways, whether we're doing it with individual people, whether we're doing it through our Dharma study or our meditation. We need that vertical dimension that's sort of rising us up or demanding more from us? Yeah, like how do we get life to demand more from us? You know, is it through doing Dharma study? Or does it mean a different way of engaging with the world? Or does it mean a different way of engaging with our friends? I mean, how often do you say to your friends, look, I did this and I did this. Can you tell me, what am I doing? You know, ask people to engage with you. Get some information from them. What's their perspective? Do you invite people to engage with you like that? Yeah. It's so difficult when we're around people to know whether you've got permission to really engage with them fully. But if someone says to you, I need someone to engage with me, can you do this for me? Then, you know, you've got a different kind of conversation that's opening up then. So give permission to the people that you want to be engaged in your life. There's this description in the Sevenfold Puja actually of, you know, when you're doing entreaty and supplication, and then the Heart Sutra follows that. And Bhante says, you have to entreat, you have to ask for the Dharma, and then the Dharma comes. So do you ask for the Dharma? Do you ask your friends? Do you ask the Dharma for the Dharma to be in your life? Is there a step, or is there something we could do that could make that happen more effectively?